Hello, this video might be a little longer than my videos usually are, and it might be a little bit rambly because I haven't scripted it. We'll see what happens in post-production editing. The reason why I want to make this video is because of an incident that happened to someone on my caseload, and which I became involved with and became incredibly frustrated by the attitude of a number of people from whom I was trying to get some support for the patient on my caseload who had become overtly suicidal. What I want to talk about is this myth, this ridiculous idea that some workers have that if a person has mental capacity, then we have no grounds and no right to prevent them from taking their own lives. This really is not the case. But to make sense of it, to show why it's not the case, because it's such a widespread myth, I will have to explain a few points, not just of law, but also of legal history in this country. So I'm going to start by very briefly explaining what we call the Bournewood case, HL versus UK. Now, HL was a profoundly autistic man in his 40s, and HL had a routine which involved in the mornings he would get picked up by transport and taken to his local day centre. But for some reason he becomes overwhelmed, he becomes distressed, and he starts banging his head against the wall. And I don't just mean gently, he was really smashing his forehead into the wall. At which point the staff at the day centre restrain him. Fair dues. It's an emergency situation. You don't have time to mess about and try to counsel somebody because the next one might create the critical head injury that kills them. So that's an emergency situation, and you use common law to intervene to do what is reasonable. There's a legal principle called the Bolam test, which could be used to see what's reasonable, and that would certainly be seen as reasonable. So the staff get him calmed down, he's no longer harming himself, and they call an ambulance. The ambulance comes along, paramedics can't communicate with him, but they take him to A&E without his consent because he can't communicate with them. But again, common law, it's an extreme situation. He might have a head injury. They need to get him checked out. Again, the Bolam test, in extremis, in an emergency situation. You don't need consent. You do what is likely to be reasonable. He gets to A&E. Now, bear in mind, this is completely out of his comfort zone. It's out of his normal routine. He becomes increasingly distressed because it's an overwhelming situation and the guy's profoundly autistic. He's seen by a local psychiatrist who admits him, again, in extremis, under common law, admits him to the local psychiatric hospital. Now, this is where it becomes a little interesting. You see, if you have someone who may be about to die and who needs, or may well need, immediate intervention, you can use common law. It's an emergency. Common law is out, consent is out, so you either use the Mental Health Act or it's kidnapping. He wasn't detained under the Mental Health Act. He was simply transported to hospital. At that point, he has been kidnapped. Not only that, but the psychiatrist writes in the notes, if he tries to leave, stop him. That's unlawful imprisonment. Not only that, his carers, the only people with whom he can communicate, are denied access to him. So he's in a strange environment with people he doesn't know, with whom he cannot communicate, he can't leave, and no mechanism is there to protect his rights. And that's one of the things you need to know about the Mental Health Act. It's there to protect a person's rights while they're detained. There are automatic processes within the Mental Health Act to ensure that people's rights are upheld, to ensure that detention is lawful and reasonable, and to remove the detention, effectively to release that person from hospital if it's seen not to be reasonable or appropriate. That's why he should have been detained. Now that case actually, over the ensuing few years, went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, who ruled that two human rights from the European Convention on Human Rights were denied him. One was the right to liberty, understandably enough, and the other was the right to respect for private and family life, because he was denied access to his carers and they were denied access to him. What happened as a result of that judgment is that there were psychiatrists all over the country assessing, under the Mental Health Act, people who had previously been in hospital simply because they didn't know where they were. So you would have people on dementia wards, for example. You'd have people with learning disabilities and autism, for example, being assessed under the Mental Health Act and being detained under the Mental Health Act, because that was to ensure that their rights were being looked after. Now, remember this point. They detained people with mental capacity, or without mental capacity, because of the Barnwood case. That does not mean that prior to the Barnwood case they couldn't detain people who had mental capacity, and it didn't mean that they couldn't still detain people after the Barnwood case who had mental capacity. It simply meant that there were people who would be detained under the Mental Health Act because that was the only way that their rights could be safeguarded. Now, there is a problem with this. People have come to misunderstand and think that if we detain people who lack capacity, that must mean we can't detain people who have capacity. But that's nonsense. So let me tell you about what happens next. We get a parliamentary process. There's a new law drafted called the Mental Capacity Act. That gives us an alternative to use of the Mental Health Act. So if you have people who lack the capacity to make a decision, and it's defined as, can they understand information related to the situation, to the decision they need to make? Can they retain that information long enough to decide? Can they use and weigh that information as part of the decision-making process? And can they communicate their decision? If they can do all those things, then they have the mental capacity to make their own decision. If they can't do all four of those, then they're seen to be lacking mental capacity to decide, and then we will act in their best interests, and that may mean a restriction or even a deprivation of their liberty. So that's what we have now as a result of the Barnwood case. Because that wasn't in place during the time that HL was detained in hospital, their only option was the Mental Health Act, and the problem was they didn't use it. Now, the Mental Health Act criteria are: does this person, because of a mental disorder, present a risk to themselves, a risk to others, or are they at risk because of self-neglect? So they're the three criteria for detention under the Mental Health Act, and it also has to be because of a mental disorder. There are other bits about the availability of treatment. We don't need to go into that for now. So what you've got effectively are three groups. You have people who meet the criteria for the Mental Health Act. You have people who can make their own decisions and who don't meet the criteria for the Mental Health Act. And then you have the group in the middle. They're people who don't meet the criteria for the Mental Health Act, but who are not capacitous, who are not able to make their own decisions. They're the people in the Bournemouth Gap. They're the people that the Mental Capacity Act is there to safeguard. Now, here's the bit that's really, really important. Just because we must use either the Mental Health Act or the Mental Capacity Act to restrict or deprive the liberty of people who lack capacity does not mean that you cannot use the Mental Health Act to detain people who have mental capacity. And here's why. Remember what I said about the criteria for the two acts. So the Mental Health Act criteria, because of a mental disorder, that person is either a risk to self, a risk to others, or at risk through self-neglect. If I'm standing on a bridge about to jump off onto a busy motorway because I've had enough and I want to end it all, that makes me a risk to self and a risk to others. In an emergency situation such as that, it is reasonable for a policeman who appears at the scene to determine that I am suffering some form of mental disorder, and therefore they can use their police holding powers. They can transport me to a place of safety to be assessed properly by mental health professionals under what's known as a Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. What if I know that it's going to kill me? What if I can say to them that I understand, these are the criteria for capacity, remember, I understand that jumping off that bridge will kill me. I have retained that information long enough to use and weigh that information as part of the decision-making process, which is that I want to take my life, and I'm thinking about that. That's the decision. I've sort of understood, I've retained, I've used and weighed that information, and I'm communicating my decision. I'm saying I want to die. I have capacity. But that does not mean that I don't present a risk to self or to others. I don't meet the criteria for the Mental Capacity Act, but I sure as damn it meet the criteria for the Mental Health Act. Does that make sense? Mental capacity has nothing to do with suicidality. And you cannot say to someone who is suicidal, oh, forget it because you got capacity. Because that will not work. It does not meet our duty of care, does not meet their need, it ignores a risk, and I think you'd be very hard pressed to get a coroner to agree with you if you were to just ignore that. But I know, because I work in mental health in this country, I know that many, many of my colleagues in mental health care will say ridiculous things like, oh, well, they've got capacity, there's nothing we can do. It's nonsense. It's a dereliction of duty. And I want to be really, really clear about that. It's a dereliction of duty. Now, we are in a position where we have a duty of care. We have a duty of care because we take the money. If you're on duty, you're on duty, a duty of care. There's a thing called neglect, which is a criminal offence, and it'll get you struck off. It may well get you imprisoned. It certainly will not put you in the coroner's good books if someone does go and jump off a motorway bridge and you decided to walk away because they had capacity. So please, please, don't do it. Remember those three groups: people who are liable under the Mental Health Act, people who are not liable under the Mental Health Act or the Mental Capacity Act, and the people in the middle in the Bournemouth Gap. If you are not liable under either act, you're probably not at risk. If you are in the Bournemouth Gap, then you will lack the mental capacity to make whatever the decision is that's in question. But that does not mean that you cannot also be in the Mental Health Act gap. It certainly doesn't mean that we need to ignore you, whether you have needs or whether you have capacity or not. I said this would be a bit rambling, and I suspect it was, but I hope I've made the point. Thank you.